Margaret Thatcher got first diluted and then got rid of their own equivalent body, the wages councils in the UK, Ireland kept the system of joint labour committees. So they've been pretty much given very little attention for 100 years until the last couple of years with the recession, and before the recession as well. And I suppose what's changed really is that employers, a certain number of employers have a confidence in the legal system, and using the legal system has become a viable, credible route for them now, which it wasn't in previous years, or particularly for the major representative bodies like IBEC, who always held back on taking action like that, and they still haven't taken kind of legal action. They've always preferred to negotiate. But we've seen a lot of breakaway employer bodies, you know, probably in electrical contracting. There's been quite a few breakaway employer organisations, and in other areas as well, and they have been much more forthright in challenging, using the legal system and spending a lot of money on that route to be able to challenge the structures and industrial relations institutions that are there. But apart from the employers' challenge, and of course the employers are saying that, well, their legal argument is that they're unconstitutional, both joint labour committees and the system of registered employment agreements. But of course the reason behind it is that they're saying that the pay rates that were set by the joint labour committees were excessive, particularly the Sunday premium rates and overtime pay rates that they set. And also as well, they're not in cooperation, but as a happy coincidence, the IMF and the EU came in giving us obviously the bailout, and part of their memorandum of understanding was that Ireland would look at increasing labour market flexibility, and part of that was, apart from the €1 reduction in the national minimum wage, that there was a commitment in the memorandum of understanding that the government would review the system of joint labour committees. As for a need to increase flexibility and facilitate readjustment in the labour market is what's used in the memorandum of understanding. So obviously to the rest of us that means reduced wages. So it's because of those two forces of the EU and IMF, and because of the employers' legal challenges, that we have such changes in systems in the last couple of years. So some research that myself and Tom have done recently, we looked at Central Statistics Office surveys of wages and earnings and working hours and all that, and we looked at who are the type of workers who are most likely to be covered by the joint labour committees, and basically all the things that you might expect for the low-paid, low-unionised sector. If you're a female, you're far more likely to be covered by these pay rates which are set by the joint labour committees. Less educated, part-time, non-Irish, and in particular if you're doing manual or routine service work, and if you work in hotels and restaurants. They're the two major factors which will contribute to the fact that you're probably working on the low wage rate set by the joint labour committees. And of course these are low wage rates. I mean, their systems set up to try and help people out of poverty and low pay, but the pay rates they set, along with the national minimum wage, are defined as low pay, because they set pay rates which are generally under 2/3 of the median earnings in the country. So that's generally defined as being low pay. And you know, even studies which were done on JLCs in the late 80s and 90s have repeatedly said this, that you know, if their objective is to try and protect low paid workers, well, they're not working, partly because they didn't cover the whole country, but also because their wage rates that they set were too low. And even when the first bit of that was corrected, so even when we got a national minimum wage to cover the whole country, those wage rates, the value of those wage rates being set by the national minimum wage has been dropping consistently over the years. So that when the national minimum wage was introduced in 2000, it was set at about 2/3 of median earnings. Now it's set at less than half of median earnings in the country. So its value is dropping. So, I mean, there hasn't been really any debate, because I suppose unions and policymakers, some policymakers have been so caught up with trying to keep them in place and trying to defend them, is that there hasn't been any real discussion as to how they really contribute to getting people out of low pay. So just in looking at what's happening in terms of earnings and hours and so on in the country, basically about a fifth, 20% of all employees in the country are low paid. And if you just look at the private sector on the right hand side, 25% of all employees in the private sector in the country are low paid, and the stat is probably from 2007, 2008. So that's a pretty big number, and that's only under, it's about at par with Germany. It's less than America, but it's way higher than most European countries. If you look at Denmark, 8% of its employees are considered low paid. So obviously Ireland is multiples of that. And obviously we've other things that go along with that as well in terms of high income inequality and so on. So if we look then at, well, what are those low paid people being paid? You can see that almost 10% of them are being paid between 9.69 and 10.86 an hour. 10.86 an hour in 2007 is the low pay rate. So 10.86 is 2/3 of median earnings. So if you're earning 10.86 and under, then you're defined as being low paid. And you can see that a lot of the JLC rates that were set in 2007 were between 8.23 and 9.68. So we took kind of a sample of all the Joint Labour Committee wage rates they set. So again, they're under the low pay rate, and 13% of all private sector low paid employees are working at that JLC rate. So they're really important because they do take up, cover a bulk of the low paid people. And then there's a small portion then who are earning less than 8.23. I know this is a bit tiny now, so I'll try and explain from down here. Just looking at, I suppose our aim in looking at this data was to try and analyse employers' arguments. Employers were saying that wages set by the Joint Labour Committees were too high and excessive, and particularly overtime pay. So there was no data on this. They didn't present any figures to back this up. So this is what we were looking at. So if you look at hours worked per week, just for people, these are just people in the JLC wage area or range. You can see that people who work under JLC wage rates work less than 30 hours a week on average. It's people who earn higher wages who are more likely to work more hours. If you look at the number of overtime hours per week worked by people, well, people who earn JLC wage rates work on average half an hour overtime per week, and it's not much higher for people above the JLC range in terms of higher wage rates. So only overtime hours, the percentage of hours worked weekly. Overtime hours only count for about 1.5% of all the hours worked by people, low-paid people working on the JLC wage rates every week. Their overtime earnings amount on average about €6 per week. And of course what's interesting is, as well, as you might expect for people who are low paid rates, they obviously earn very little in terms of bonuses. So we're talking 90 cents a week on average in bonuses earned by people in low wage rates. And of course people who are on higher wage rates, they're much more likely to get bonuses. So people who earn more than the JLC wage rates get about €21 a week on average in terms of bonuses. The other issue that's really interesting is in terms of people who work on JLC wage rates and who work shifts. And you can see that almost a third of people, 31.4% of people who earn JLC wage rates work a shift. But if you look at the number of people who get a shift allowance, they only get about 70 cents a week on average in shift allowance, meaning basically that people are working shift hours and not getting shift pay for it. So this is obviously another feature which is contributing to their low pay, is that they're working all kinds of hours for very basic pay, unlike people who are more likely to be higher paid or more likely to get shift allowances, more likely to get bonuses and so on. So basically, I mean, what the data is telling us is that the argument that employers are making that the overtime hours are excessive and overtime pay is excessive doesn't hold up when you look at the actual number of overtime hours and earnings that people work in those low paid sectors. And that's the same whether it's hotels and restaurants or retail or whatever it is. So then, apart from that anyway, I mean, data doesn't matter when it comes to policy making sometimes, and even with that data, the High Court, when the fast food employers, John Briggs Fried Chicken in Cork City, so when he took a case against the Joint Labour Committee for the catering sector, and he took it to the High Court in 2011, he won in the High Court, and it was on the basis, a legal argument that basically in our constitution the Oireachtas is only supposed to set laws, and if they do give any law-making power to any other body, that they have to give them a lot of principles and rules and guidance. And that even when they do give a lot of those principles and rules and guidance, there's still some legal argument as to whether they're allowed to give the amount of power that JLCs and RAs have in terms of being able to set wages and conditions which are legally binding on the entire sector. And under those systems, if an employer is found to have breached them, as you know probably from the construction-related area, then there could potentially be criminal prosecutions against them, although that's more related to the Joint Labour Committees than the registered employment agreements. So the High Court found that the catering JLC was unconstitutional, and certain sections of the legislation which set them up as being unconstitutional. So basically that has left the whole JLC system in limbo for the best part of a year and a half. And then we had the Electrical Contracting Registered Employment Agreement, which went through a similar process in terms of breakaway electrical employers who were not happy with the registered employment agreement for the electrical contracting sector, and then they took a case on the same constitutional arguments, and the Supreme Court most recently, that should be 2013, the Supreme Court agreed that the registered employment agreements are unconstitutional. The decision of the Supreme Court in relation to registered employment agreements is more far-reaching than the previous one on the Joint Labour Committees, because the previous one on the Joint Labour Committees just said that certain sections of the legislation was unconstitutional, whereas the Supreme Court has said that a whole part of the legislation is unconstitutional. Now this can mess things up for the legislation that the government has introduced to try and protect registered employment agreements and joint labour committees, and I'll come back to that. So it's more far-reaching. So again, a lot of money being pumped into this, and this means more trouble, I think, down the line. I've spoken to trade union officials who are heavily involved in the joint labour committees, and they say they're not overly concerned about the new legislation which is being brought in, but I'm more concerned than they are. Because I think because employers have been so successful now with these cases, it means that they are going to take more chances when the new legislation is brought in, and they are going to try their hand at challenging the legislation to try and dismantle any new system that is set up. So I do think it's more troublesome than maybe what the unions think. Then what happened is that in between the legal cases and after the IMF came in, like I mentioned, part of the commitment of the government to get the bailout was that they would review the Joint Labour Committee system. So they had a report produced on should the system of Joint Labour Committees and registered employment agreements be retained, and the Walsh-Duffy report with Kevin Walsh, the chairman of the Labour Court, recommended that the whole system should be changed, but that they should be retained, but should be changed in some way. And there was a whole bunch of different things that they recommended, and a lot of these have been included in the subsequent legislation. So I suppose most importantly, what has really changed for trade unions and for employees, abolishing 3 JLCs is not really a huge deal because they were old JLCs anyway, which weren't really extremely important. But providing the inability to pay clause is obviously pretty substantial in terms that's never been there before. And it's interesting that's been brought in during a Labour Party coalition. So the idea that an individual employer can apply to plead inability to pay whatever Joint Labour Committee pay rates will be introduced on the basis that they can't afford it. And it's interesting because of the Labour Party being in power, because in the 1980s something similar was suggested, that there should be an inability to pay clause introduced for employers who couldn't pay the minimum wage rate set by the Joint Labour Committees, and the Labour Party in opposition at the time said no, that there would be absolutely no point of having a minimum wage setting system at all if you're going to have an inability to pay system. But obviously it's gone through this time, and obviously what's happened is that there's been an element of significant bargaining, where you have unions have got what they want to an extent, in the sense that the Joint Labour Committee and registered employment agreement systems will be retained in the new legislation, but they've all then had to give it up basically as part of the compromise, certain things like the inability to pay clause. So the Minister has basically tried to say, well look, I'm leaving one party half happy and the other party half happy as well, and just about enough to force the legislation through. So that's what he's done with the Industrial Relations Amendment Act 2012. Mr Bruton has said that he's going to retain the Joint Labour Committee and Registered Employment Agreement system, but they are going to be changed quite a lot. And I suppose the big questions now are the changes going to be just like the changes that Margaret Thatcher did in the 1980s, where she kept her minimum wage system, the wage councils, but reduced their powers so much that they really couldn't do much. And is that going to be the same now with these bodies, that they're going to have to go through such a rigmarole to be able to set wages to begin with, and because of the use of the legal system by employers, that are their powers going to be reduced to such an extent that they won't be able to do very much. So Janet Hughes, who's the former Rights Commissioner, has said in her most recent report, which is out in the last couple of weeks, on the Joint Labour Committee system, that the new procedures which have been set up in the legislation for how the Joint Labour Committees and Registered Employment Agreements will work, and she said they call them the most restrictive and onerous process for collective bargaining in the state. And despite this, you still have commentators who say that it's still not radical enough. So basically what the Act says is that for now the Joint Labour Committees won't be able to set any Sunday premiums. So despite the data that myself and Tom had looked at earlier, that Sunday premiums, according to the data, isn't a problem, but in any case the legislation says that the joint labour committees, the newly reformed joint labour committees, won't be able to set Sunday working premiums. Employers will be able to plead inability to pay, although there are procedures that they have to go through for that. And I think more serious is how the joint labour committees and the registered employment agreements are going to have to work. And the way in which they're going to have to work is that they're going to have to take into consideration a whole range of issues when deciding what minimum pay conditions are going to be. And the particular issues which are being set out is that they're going to have to consider the legitimate interests of employers and workers, the financial and commercial interests of employers, unemployment levels, level of wages in comparable sectors, and wage levels in competitor EU countries as well, taking into account purchasing power in those countries. But that's quite a list, and it's a much more stringent list. It's based on a bill which Fianna Fáil had produced before they came out of power, and they had a similar list, but it was nowhere near as onerous as this list. So the Fianna Fáil list didn't have anything about wage levels in competitor EU countries or unemployment levels or things like that, so this is much stricter. And I know union officials said, well, you know, these are the kind of things we argue all the time. So when we are looking for pay increases, we argue about, you know, the interests of employers and the interests of employees and so on. My concern would be that when the legislation, I mean, it's introduced, but when the new system is set up of joint labour committees, there's nothing in legislation to say that one factor should have greater weight than another factor. It just says they have to consider all these issues. And I think what's probably likely to happen is that if a bunch of employers are not happy with the wage rates that are set by these bodies, they'll take a judicial review or legal action against the bodies and say, well, look, the bodies, the joint labour committees didn't take into account unemployment levels enough, or they didn't take into account wage levels in competitor EU countries enough. And I think that's where there's going to be quite a lot of difficulty. And even when the Labour Court is signing off pretty much on the new wage rates, they also have to check if the joint labour committees have gone through these issues. So it's going to be, I think, extremely onerous on both sides and not of any real interest to both sides who are trying to set wages. And the registered employment agreements and the joint labour committees, when they're set up, the orders that they set can be changed without necessarily the consent of all the parties to the agreement. So there is provision there for the Labour Court to be able to change the agreements or the orders, even if the parties themselves don't agree to it. And that employers will be able to plead inability to pay even if they don't get the consent of the employees that work for them. So there's quite a lot of loopholes, I suppose you could call them, in the legislation, depending on how you look at it. Just in terms of Jan Hughes, her report, and there's been nothing but report after report about the joint labour committees, but since the legislation was introduced, it was required in the legislation that another review of joint labour committees be undertaken, and Jan Hughes, the former Rights Commissioner, did that. And she made a series of recommendations. As far as I can see, I mean, she has tried to tidy them up, but as far as I can see, the recommendations she's made, the Minister has chosen the recommendations which have involved narrowing the scope of the joint labour committees and rejects the recommendations which involved expanding the scope of the joint labour committees. So, for example, in agriculture, there's a narrowing of the workers who are going to be covered under that. For the catering industry, Janet Hughes had recommended getting rid of the geographical distinctions, just have a catering joint labour committee for the whole country rather than the kind of silly ones we have at the moment, which is catering for Cork only or catering just for Dublin only. But the Minister has rejected that. Hairdressing, there's going to be a narrowing of the workers covered by that. It's only going to be hairdressers now. Before it used to be manicurists and other people who work in kind of hairdressing establishments. Again, the Minister rejected the recommendation to expand the geography that the hairdressing JLC will cover. Hotels, it's just been clarified a little bit, that has expanded slightly, so hotels will now cover things like leisure facilities and other things that are closely related to hotel activities. And I suppose the big one, and Robert might comment himself on this from the mandate perspective, but the retail grocery one now is not going to apply to independent retailers. So it's only going to apply to the large multiples or symbol operated franchises like the Spars and so on. So it's not going to operate the shop down the road. And usually those are people who you might consider are maybe very vulnerable because they're least likely to be unionised, because they're small and so on. But that's what's happening. So that's kind of just the run through in terms of joint labour committees and registered employment agreements. I suppose separately to that then there's obviously a bunch of registered employment agreements which have been set up because the JLCs went kind of into limbo. and in particular Contra Cleaning and Security have tried to move to a registered employment agreement system. Cleaning has worked and security hasn't yet. Now, the wording of the Janet Hughes review and the wording of the Minister is that he thinks that the cleaning and security will move back from a registered employment agreement to a joint labour committee. I'd be interested. I haven't talked to unions yet on that, but I'd be interested to see if they'd like that to happen, because as far as I would see, I would think a registered employment agreement is a better system than a joint labour committee system. So I'd be surprised if unions wanted to move back, but we'll see. So that's basically what happened at the moment. It's still in no-go. We were waiting for all these systems to be brought back into place again, but I expect it's going to be a very slow, cumbersome process, and that there's going to be a lot of challenges along the way for these bodies to remain as they are. Just briefly then, the other area I was asked us to look at is the payment of wages, just because there's been so many cases about wages that have ended up in the rights commissioners and employment appeals tribunal and so on, basically where unions have tried to resist unilateral pay cuts by taking lots of cases against employers under the Payment of Wages Act. So for example, it was 2 years ago that FIPTA submitted 1,000 individual cases relating to community employment schemes. I know in other areas unions have tried to do that as well, in the hope that there would be, a number of test cases which will decide what will happen for the rest of the cases. And some employers have tried to frustrate that process by not allowing test cases and making, the 1,000 individual cases be heard by the state bodies to drag the whole thing out and make it more cumbersome and administratively burdensome. But unions were initially successful at resisting pay cuts because under the Payment of Wages Act it says that deductions cannot be made from people's wages without people's agreement to it and without it being stated in people's contracts. So unions were able to get compensation or arrears in pay for people who had unilateral deduction and bonuses and allowances and increments in pay and so on. The problem now is that it looks like that can't be done anymore. So there was a High Court decision 3 years ago in relation to travel allowances in the public sector, and in that case the High Court said that the Payment of the Wages Act has no application to reductions as opposed to deductions. Now it didn't actually, that's its exact quote, so we're getting to legal semantics here now, because it didn't say reductions in pay. The case was about travel allowances. So I think you probably need a couple of more cases to come through about wages specifically. But basically, since that High Court case has happened, it's kind of strange what's kind of happened, because since the High Court case, other cases which have gone under the Act to the Rights Commissioners, unions have won them. So Rights Commissioners have said that they've found breaches for a reduction in wages, and unions have won those cases, and they've given compensation to employees under the Act for reductions in wages. Although I should point out that in some of the cases, while the Rights Commissioner found that there had been a breach of the Wages Act in terms of just cutting people's pay, they also then considered the company's financial position and said, well, the company's in such dire straits, it's okay in the end, more or less. Whereas the EAT now, more importantly, has said in a couple of cases in the last couple of months that they are now following the High Court decision that I mentioned, and they are saying that in a case that have gone before it, the Payment of Wages Act doesn't cover reductions in pay, only deductions. But again, there's a couple of little things about the cases that it was ruling on or deciding on, which might turn things if there was more cases to go ahead. But basically, it looks like for the moment that you can't take a Payment of Wages Act case if you have a unilateral reduction in pay. So where does that leave employees? Well, obviously there's the old-fashioned routes of things like industrial action, however unrealistic maybe that might be at the moment. People can still make claims, but just not under the Payment of Wages Act. So they can try and go to the Rights Commission, the Labour Court under the Industrial Relations legislation, and try to say that it's unfair in some way. There's still the possibility that people can take a constructive dismissal case under the unfair dismissal legislation. So if they get a unilateral reduction in pay, that they then resign from their job and then take a case against their employer claiming that they had no option but to resign because that the reduction in their pay was such a breach of their contract that they had no option but to resign. So they could try that. And of course they could try still going to the civil courts obviously you need a bit of money behind you there, but you could try going to the Circuit Court and the High Court and so on in terms of the fact that there's a breach of contracts. Yeah.
I think there are quite a number of good arguments out there to the contrary. But what appears to be happening is that you take the employers to the Rights Commission or the Management Tribunal, and the Management Tribunal, they see the strength of your case and they settle. And there's a particular argument out there, Mike can fill you in a little bit more, that has been working on, that has had several, 10 or 12 cases settled in the Employment Appeals Tribunal simply because the employers have the financial ability to pay out on the day, and like you're looking at this member that possibly has been fighting for near on 2.5 years and has been told, here's all your money, which will not go ahead today. The Rights Commissioner's case that you might have lost an appeal to the tribunal stands, and the members paid money. So it's time for that case to be fully heard. The
argument we're putting forward is something like what John Grace used in his argument as well. And that was, it was an interference with the peaceful enjoyment of somebody's possessions. And under the 2003 European Convention on Human Rights Act, every organ of the state is meant to uphold a person's entitlements under the European Convention. And therefore we would argue that the unjust enrichment of the employer by doing something which was unlawful and deducting the wages, that he could not be compensated, that the employer could not be unjustly enriched and the employee not compensated. And as Rob said there, we've broadened that argument and we brought the whole European context into it, and each time that we presented an employer with that case, they are settled
without fail.
Without fail,
every occasion.
So there is an alternative. And there's another alternative. Section 4 of the Theft Act. You go to your local guard station and you say that my employer has appropriated my money because under the Wages Act it clearly says wages that are properly payable. So therefore that's where the reduction comes into being a deduction, because if you take what's properly payable under the contract. So there's a couple of lines that we're going to test now. I know that Brian went a minute, one of his members to make a complaint to the Gardaí in Roxburgh Road Guard Station not so long ago, that the employer had the wages and wouldn't hand them over, he was going to deduct some money, and the guards went out to the back of the squad car and made him pay over the money.
It's time to take ahead for any stream.
But it also should be said that, I mean, trade union recognition rights is the key to all of this. It all goes back there because of...
Yeah, well, I think Tom will bring up, and I suppose the difficulty I think for unions is when you get more and more into the legal quagmire. So I mean, Tom is going to bring this up in relation to union recognition, but I think particularly they say the union case that were brought on against Ryanair and against the union recognition legislation, how getting further into legal arguments can backfire as well, and Tom will talk about that, So, I mean, it's solicitors themselves anyway, even with these cases, I mean, solicitors themselves, you wouldn't advise employers anyway at this stage because there isn't enough clarity on the issue anyway, and hopefully those cases will work out. But I suppose it means then that it means that unions are constantly dependent on a favourable legal case to get them what they want.
Yeah.
You're kind of putting the eggs into that basket, unlike the Garda one, which is a bit different. But it'll be interesting to see how it work out, but Tom will talk about that.